Great to have Matthew Waters back with us from Legal Sports Report as we dive into the latest updated news in sports betting. We'll talk about the state of Washington, D.C., some potential changes coming there as well. But Matt, great to have you here on the show. Let's open up by talking about this Jontay Porter story. Naturally, I guess this kind of slipped by me because I didn't realize that outside of the United States, he played in Canada too. And, some of the stuff they have there is extremely strict. What's going on there with some of these latest allegations with some of the co-conspirators that he had involved in his, let's just call it his tanking case for his, point. I don't know. Is it point shaving? Did he shave anything? I guess off a prop. Can we even use that term?
I don't know if we can use shaving. Maybe he shaved some minutes off of his expected playing time when he checked out early in those games. But yeah, we found out Tuesday that the Ontario Provincial Police are opening up a probe into this as well. And, that's obviously it's bad news for Jontay, but it's good news for the sports betting industry as a whole, right? It's being shown that, even if they find out that none of this betting did happen in Toronto or, whatever they could be looking into, it's good to see that all of these law enforcement agencies are coming together to try to figure out what's going on here. And we also can't forget how this happened on the back end too. DraftKings was the one that reported this suspicious prop betting behavior to the International Betting Integrity Association. And then the IBIA went to the FBI and it kind of started to roll from there. The OPP basically said that, in relation to these online betting irregularities, as they called them, we determined that we have to look into it. They said that it's warranted. So, we don't know how it's going to turn out in Toronto or for his four co-conspirators. But it is a positive that everybody is taking this seriously and that we're seeing an international effort on this. And another thing about that IBIA, they just signed a deal with Genius Sports last week. That's huge when you talk about getting more eyes on these potential irregularities. Genius Sports provides so much data to sports betting operators out there. And so certainly if they're seeing an irregularity, passing it along to IBIA, you just have to think that the industry gets a little bit tighter with that agreement. Jontay Porter is, he's got his hands full right now, but I think in terms of optics for the sports betting industry, I think this is a positive for sure.
Yeah, and again, Canada handles things differently than the United States, and we'll just have to follow this from the outside in. The other part of our conversation today, Matthew, involves a lot of legalese, so I'm going to need you to get to the bottom of this. I read this article on Legal Sports Report. So some potential changes coming to Washington, D.C., but, there's amendments and there's budget changes. I guess I'm just going to need you to break this all down for me. What will it mean in the long term if some of this stuff passes?
What it will mean, Craig, is that DC will finally get an open, competitive mobile sports betting market. Let's go back to the beginning. And it started back in 2018, 2019, when Jack Evans, who was eventually thrown off of the DC Council for various reasons, he helped push along this deal that saw Intralot, who was already supplying the DC lottery with lottery products. Intralot became the sports betting provider through a no-bid contract. And that has gone miserably in DC. Their product, Gambit DC, they started off trying to get a 20% hold. They thought bettors wouldn't care, and they were wrong. You started to see people going to the physical locations in DC to bet instead of using Gambit. And so Councilman McDuffie has been overseeing this for years now. He has had some difficult conversations with leadership from the DC Lottery, and he finally put together a bill that is now coming through the budget that says, okay, we want to do this right. We want DC to operate how the other states are operating around them, the other states that DC residents are going to make their bets because they're getting better odds there and they have more options. So this would open up 7 mobile sports betting licenses that would be available throughout the DC, except for those federal land carve outs there, which geolocation does an amazing job in tracking that kind of stuff. So we're looking at 7 potential operators there, and they could be live potentially a week after budget approval. All they have to do is prove that they do have a deal with a sports team. The licenses are going through their 7 professional sports teams. So They have to prove they have that license. They have to pay a non-refundable $2 million application fee for the first 5-year license. And they have to be licensed in no less than 5 U.S. jurisdictions, which the big guys, they all check that very easily. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with FanDuel. Intralot and the lottery actually came together and subcontracted out and cut Gambit in April and gave those operations to FanDuel. And FanDuel has been performing well for DC because they're FanDuel and they know how to operate sports betting. They're upset about the idea that this could change. The contract on this Intralot, FanDuel, lottery, what have you deal is up this summer. So they needed an extension for that. So there's a lot of things up in the air for DC sports betting right now. The next time we hear about this is going to be next week. The budget is going to get, I believe it's going to be the final hearing next week. And so we could get a finalized vote on this. And there was an amendment trying to strip the language for these licenses out, and it failed. And there were, I think the amendment was put forward in good faith. One of the issues is that Gambit and Intralot have a bunch of retail betting kiosks in small businesses throughout DC. And so rightfully so, some council members are concerned about how this may change that. You know, some of these operations have become dependent on this betting revenue. And Councilman McDuffie said, look, you know, that's not going to happen. If you look at our agreement, if Intralot, FanDuel, what have you, if they decide to pull out of this, in 15 days, we can get new operators in here and working. And he said some of the kiosks that people are concerned about losing, some of them haven't been working for months, he added. So it's a polarizing issue in DC right now, but it looks like we're going to get an open market in DC.
All right, so that would add a lot of different sports betting operators there, and naturally we'll follow that as we go. I'm sure, Matthew, you followed the story that was the biggest sports wagering story of the week earlier this week when it was announced that Florida will retain exclusive access rights via the Seminole tribe to sports betting through the year 2051. We also learned that potentially they could open up the doors for other sports providers to jump in as a partnership with the Seminole tribe, essentially paying them to become part of it. Were there any other big takeaways from you with this now that you've had a couple of days to absorb the news?
Well, Craig, what's interesting is that we saw a lot of we saw the 3 main online stocks that we watch when it comes to online sports betting operators, DraftKings, Penn, and Flutter. They all rose significantly on the news. They all were up more than 6% on that news. And it's interesting because this is the outcome that we thought was happening in Florida. But now, you know, with the comments to LSR from Hard Rock CEO Jim Allen saying that these guys could come in on a licensing revenue share kind of basis, you know, that could be great. But I think the market is also looking at how this ruling can affect other jurisdictions out there with a lot of tribal influence. Naturally, you automatically think of California, Oklahoma. How could this help? And I don't know that we're going to see a whole lot of movement in other states based off of this, but certainly the market takes it as a positive. And remember, we had a big deal signed between Oklahoma and Canby, who provides sports betting technology, with one of their huge tribes in there. And I personally think Oklahoma could work a little bit faster. But for the big brands, we're just going to have to wait and see how it shakes out.
All right, Matthew, great stuff as always. We'll see you next week. Thanks for coming on Newswire.
Thank you.